Cedar Grove was, at a glance, the quintessential suburban oasis. Neat lawns trimmed with precision, family-sized houses sporting tasteful shutters, and a winding network of streets lined with steadfast oak trees. Situated a short drive from a mid-sized American city, Cedar Grove felt worlds apart from the hustle and noise of urban life. Here, neighbors exchanged polite nods from driveways, kids rode scooters on pristine sidewalks, and the local newsletter praised the community spirit that seemed to bind everyone together. It was no surprise that an active homeowners association, HOA, oversaw Cedar Grove's bylaws, social events, and maintenance guidelines. Many residents appreciated the tidy uniformity. After all, crisp fences and well-maintained parks promised a safe and pleasant environment. Yet beneath the pleasant exterior lingered an open secret. At the helm of the HOA was a woman widely nicknamed Karen, though her legal name was Marilyn Atwood. She was a middle-aged whirlwind of officiousness, prone to policing the tiniest of infractions. Whether she was scanning trash can placement or the exact shade of mulch in gardens, Marilyn's presence was felt in every corner of Cedar Grove. Outside of her official position, she was simply called Karen by neighbors who, out of her earshot, grumbled about her penchant for confrontation. She seemed to thrive on hyper-controlling the environment around her. Anything that strayed from the strict guidelines inevitably incurred her wrath. In hushed tones, people often joked that she could identify a non-compliant mailbox from half a mile away. They didn't dare voice these frustrations to her face, though, for fear of summonses, fines, or, worse, a public berating. Life went on in Cedar Grove more or less peacefully, as long as you remained on the right side of Karen's persnickety rules. But all it took was one small misstep, an unapproved fence color, a child's lemonade stand set up near the curb, to find yourself on the receiving end of her righteous indignation. She would march over, scribbling notes on her ever-present clipboard and scolding the offenders with relish. Yet for most of that spring, the trouble she caused was relatively tame. Terse letters about front yard flower choices or warnings about weekend noise levels. Neighbors grumbled, but generally complied. They'd grown used to sidestepping Karen's lectures whenever they could. It was not until the announcement of the Cedar Grove Charity Bazaar, an annual summertime event to raise funds for local causes, that the community would see just how far Karen was willing to go to assert her version of order. On the surface, a charity event seemed like the perfect reflection of neighborhood goodwill. Booths selling baked goods, handmade crafts, and gently used items, all contributing to a shared philanthropic goal. But behind the scenes, Karen's involvement threatened to overshadow that simple generosity. No one understood this dynamic better than Ms. Gwen Bunting, an elderly widow known for her heartfelt crocheted creations. She had lived in Cedar Grove for 2 decades and often donated handmade hats and blankets to hospitals and local shelters. Those who knew her admired the quiet kindness in her eyes and the gentle patience that guided her gnarled hands as she worked with yarn in soft pastel shades. For Ms. Bunting, the upcoming charity bazaar was a golden opportunity to sell her crocheted items and donate the proceeds to a children's cancer fund. She believed wholeheartedly in the cause and had spent months preparing her handiwork. Little did Ms. Bunting realize that Karen's eagle-eyed obsession with community aesthetics would bring them into a collision course. A crocheted booth might have seemed harmless, but in Cedar Grove, even the most innocent pursuits could become an HOA battlefield, especially when Karen was involved. Marilyn Karen Atwood was in her early 50s, though she carried herself with an air of authority more reminiscent of a hardened official than a suburban homemaker. She usually wore neatly pressed khaki pants or crisp skirts, paired with blouses that exuded businesslike severity. A silver bob cut framed her face, making her sharp features stand out. She never went anywhere without her leather-bound portfolio, bursting with documents detailing the HOA's covenants, codes, and restrictions. While Karen held the title of chair of the Cedar Grove HOA, she treated that role more like a personal fiefdom. She would conduct surprise inspections of neighborhood yards, taking photos of the smallest infractions, an unapproved rosebush color, a non-regulation mailbox flag, or a decorative garden gnome deemed distracting to passers-by. She prided herself on enforcing the standards that keep Cedar Grove looking its best, oblivious to how exasperated it made her neighbors. Indeed, Some speculated that her relentless devotion to policing came from a deeper place of insecurity. Rumors circulated that she'd tried to run for city council once, only to fail in humiliating fashion. Another rumor suggested she had a sour relationship with her adult children, who had fled the nest and rarely returned, possibly driven away by her controlling personality. No one could confirm these rumors, but the seeds of speculation only fueled the local image of Karen as a meddling busybody who overcompensated for her personal disappointments by ruling the HOA with an iron fist. In official HOA newsletters, Karen's columns always read like stern proclamations. She wielded her words with the same precision with which she inspected lawns, scolding, instructing, and ensuring that her authority was never questioned. Yet she ended every column with a chirpy, "Thank you for keeping our neighborhood so lovely," as though that absolved her of any heavy-handedness. When the Cedar Grove Charity Bazaar Planning Committee convened, it was Karen who volunteered, insisted, really, to chair the Booth Standards and Layout Subcommittee. At first, people were relieved that the day-to-day scheduling of events would fall to more easygoing residents, leaving Karen only in charge of the site map and booth regulations. But soon enough, she started emailing participants about booth sizes, color themes, and how each vendor was expected to present their wares in an HOA-approved manner. Anyone who read the fine print realized this was no simple set of guidelines. Karen wanted every booth to look like an exhibit in a curated museum. Standard vinyl tablecloths in muted earth tones, no flamboyant signage, and absolutely no excessive clutter. She insisted that consistency fosters harmony, ignoring the fact that a charity bazaar often thrived on a vibrant variety of displays. While many participants grumbled, they tried to comply, hoping to avoid a confrontation. Yet Ms. Bunting was blissfully unaware of these ironclad rules. She had signed up with the assumption that the event was about good cheer and giving hearts. Her booth, she imagined, would be lined with crocheted hats, scarves, blankets, and stuffed animals in bright pastel hues. She'd even sewn small tags onto each item that read, "Handcrafted with love, proceeds for kids' cancer research." Proud of her upcoming contribution, she didn't question that her booth might clash with a certain someone's obsession with uniformity. The stage was set. When Karen caught wind of Ms. Bunting's plan, an abundance of crocheted items in every color under the sun, displayed on a frilly, handmade tablecloth, she felt an internal shudder. This was not the tidy, subdued aesthetic she envisioned for Cedar Grove. To Karen, Ms. Bunting's crocheted extravaganza could easily be labeled craft clutter. And so began the tension that would culminate in one of the most shocking incidents in Cedar Grove's recent history, a moment that exposed just how far Karen would go to prove she was in control. In a cozy, single-story home near the end of Hemlock Lane, Ms. Gwen Bunting spent every spare moment crocheting. Balls of soft yarn in lavender, baby pink, sky blue, mint green, and pale yellow sat arranged in baskets around her living room. The gentle click of her crochet hook formed a soothing rhythm that often lured her cat, Marmalade, into a purring nap by her feet. Widowed for nearly a decade, Ms. Bunting had found solace in yarn craft. She discovered that the repetitive motion of crocheting eased her loneliness, and the joy of gifting her creations to those in need filled her heart with purpose. During the winter, she would donate thick hats and scarves to a local homeless shelter. In the spring, she made pastel blankets for newborns at the hospital. And now, with summer approaching, she focused on lightweight hats and whimsical stuffed animals to sell at the charity bazaar. Her modest living room resembled a craft studio. On a side table, an old laptop displayed patterns she'd found online, some featuring intricate stitches, others with cutesy animal faces. Every pattern was a learning opportunity, and Ms. Bunting delighted in perfecting each stitch. She compiled her finished items in labeled boxes, already envisioning the cheerful faces of children who might wear her hats or snuggle up to her crocheted teddy bears. She had never met Karen in person, beyond a few glimpses of the HOA head marching down the street like a woman on a mission. Ms. Bunting had heard rumblings of how strict and confrontational she could be, but since Ms. Bunting rarely caused a stir, her lawn was always neatly trimmed, her home painted in an HOA-approved color, she had escaped Karen's scrutiny. Or so she assumed. As the bazaar neared, Ms. Bunting meticulously planned her booth decor. a soft lilac tablecloth trimmed with lace, a little sign in cursive letters reading "Crochet for a Cause," and a handful of crocheted bunting flags, no pun intended, hung from the edges of the table. She pictured the bright colors drawing people in, each purchase generating money for pediatric cancer research. If all went well, she hoped to write a generous check to the local children's hospital by the end of the event. When Ms. Bunting mentioned these details to a friend at the community center, however, the friend's face grew uneasy. "Karen won't like bright tablecloths," her friend warned. "She's insisted on neutral colors for uniformity. She might ask you to change it." Ms. Bunting waved a hand dismissively. "I'm sure if she knows it's for charity, she won't mind a little splash of color," she said, optimism shining in her kind eyes. "We want to spread warmth and joy, not stifle it." Still, a small note of concern lodged itself in Ms. Bunting's mind. Perhaps she should email the planning committee and confirm her booth details. But time slipped away between crocheting final pieces, labeling everything, and trying to decide how to arrange her display. She never got around to seeking official approval, figuring no one would object to a table dedicated to helping sick children. Had she known Karen's personality better, she might have realized that no good deed was exempt from the HOA's watchful eyes, and that her pastel crocheted wonderland would soon become a prime target for Karen's controlling streak. The morning of the Cedar Grove Charity Bazaar dawned bright and warm, with a sky so blue it looked freshly painted. Volunteers bustled into the neighborhood's Central Park area, setting up rows of collapsible tables under the watchful gaze of old oak trees. Booths popped up left and right. Homemade cookies, artisanal soaps, secondhand books, potted succulents. Laughter floated on the breeze, accompanied by the shuffle of people unloading vehicles and the murmur of friendly conversation. Ms. Bunting arrived early, wearing a simple floral blouse and white slacks. Her gray hair was arranged in a practical bun, and her eyes shone with a quiet excitement. She pulled a small cart carrying labeled boxes of her crocheted items, dozens of hats, blankets, scarves, and stuffed animals. Setting up at her assigned spot, she carefully draped her lilac tablecloth, smoothing any wrinkles. She then placed her crocheted bunting flags along the edges, each flag a different pastel color. Finally, she arranged the hats and small blankets in neat stacks, sorting them by size and style. A gentle breeze ruffled her lace tablecloth, giving a whimsical look to her booth. Passers-by were already noticing the bright display. A few wandered over to admire the items. "Oh, these are adorable," one mother said, picking up a pastel pink baby hat. "I love the little bow." Ms. Bunting smiled warmly. "Thank you. Every cent goes to the children's cancer ward at Maple Hospital." It wasn't long before Ms. Bunting sold her first piece, a crocheted rabbit that made a little girl squeal with delight. Her father handed over cash, and Ms. Bunting tucked it into a donation jar with a happy grin. She was off to a wonderful start. That was when Karen appeared. Ms. Bunting noticed her from a distance. A woman in a neatly pressed tan skirt, her steel gray bob perfectly in place, striding with a clipboard against her chest. Karen's face bore a look of thinly veiled disapproval as she scanned the booths. Every so often, she would stop to point out some detail to a vendor, scribble on her clipboard, and then move on. Ms. Bunting watched Karen approach with a polite smile. Maybe she's here to see how it's all going, Ms. Bunting thought. Perhaps she'll be happy to know we're raising good money. But as Karen's eyes landed on the flamboyant lilac tablecloth and the crocheted bunting flags, her entire demeanor stiffened. "Good morning," Ms. Bunting said, forcing a cheerful tone. "I'm Gwen Bunting. Can I help you with anything?" Karen's gaze flicked from the crocheted flags to the pastel stacks of crocheted hats. "I'm Marilyn Atwood, head of the HOA," she said curtly. "We agreed on a uniform booth color scheme, neutral vinyl tablecloths. Your setup violates the guidelines." The corners of Ms. Bunting's smile wavered. "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize. I was under the impression that as long as everything was neat and safe, it would be acceptable. It's all for charity." Karen cut her off with a raised hand. "The guidelines are there for a reason, Ms. Bunting. We want the bazaar to look organized and consistent. This crocheted tablecloth," she poked at the lilac fabric with a pen, "is not neutral. And these flags are gaudy. We can't have the park looking like a carnival sideshow." Ms. Bunting felt heat rising in her cheeks. She was not used to confrontation, and Karen's condescending tone shook her. But the children's hospital asked if I could display bright colors. She explained gently. It's supposed to be uplifting. Karen frowned, tapping her pen on her clipboard. Cedar Grove has standards, she said. I understand it's for a good cause, but you still need to comply. I'm afraid I'll have to file a formal note of violation. A couple of onlookers who overheard the exchange looked uncomfortable. One tried to intervene. Karen, come on, it's just crocheted stuff for a fundraiser. Aren't we being a bit harsh? Karen glared at them. Rules are rules. If we allow one booth to break them, others will follow, and soon there'll be chaos. She turned back to Ms. Bunting. I suggest you replace the tablecloth with something neutral immediately. Ms. Bunting's hands trembled. She'd spent weeks crocheting these decorations. I didn't know. I only brought this one, she stammered. I don't have another tablecloth with me. And the flags they're just little bits of crochet. They look sweet to visitors. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. You can remove them or face a potential fine, she snapped, scribbling on her clipboard. I'll be back to check. With that, she turned and marched off to the next booth, leaving Ms. Bunting shaken. For a moment, Ms. Bunting considered packing everything up. The confrontation had rattled her. But then she looked around at the crocheted hats and blankets. Countless hours of care, all intended to help sick children. She thought of the father who had just purchased a crocheted rabbit for his daughter, who beamed with excitement. Surely that means more than a color rule, Ms. Bunting reasoned, taking a deep breath. Resolved to stand her ground, Ms. Bunting decided to stay. But she couldn't shake the ominous feeling that Karen, with her clipboard and unwavering sense of authority, would be back soon, and that this would not end pleasantly. Morning slipped toward noon, and the event grew livelier. Families strolled through the rows of booths, sampling cookies, sipping lemonade, and chatting with neighbors. Ms. Bunting's booth drew a steady trickle of interest. People marveled at the skillful crochet work, and the small sign indicating that all proceeds went to pediatric cancer research tugged at generous hearts. Every few minutes, another sale lifted Ms. Bunting's spirits. She began to hope that Karen's stern warning was just a one-time scolding. She even mustered the courage to wander away from her booth briefly, chatting with Ms. Ortiz, who was selling homemade jams, to request a neutral tablecloth if she happened to have a spare. Ms. Ortiz offered to look in her car. Don't let Karen bully you, Ms. Ortiz whispered conspiratorially. Half of us only complied because we didn't want to fuss. But as Ms. Bunting returned to her booth, she found Karen already there, inspecting the crocheted decorations with evident displeasure. Karen's eyes flicked up when she noticed Ms. Bunting approach. I see you haven't replaced the tablecloth, she said icily, hooking a thumb at the lilac cloth. Nor removed these crocheted flags. Ms. Bunting forced a polite smile, heart pounding. I've asked around, but I haven't found a neutral cloth yet. Please understand, I'm trying to focus on serving customers and raising money for the hospital. Could we perhaps make an exception? Or I can donate a little extra to show my appreciation. Karen bristled. Exceptions undermine consistency. It's not fair to others who followed the guidelines. I already filed one note of violation in your name. If you insist on ignoring the rules, I may have to escalate this. Watching from a short distance, neighbors exchanged grim looks. Many found it ridiculous that a pastel crocheted tablecloth and bunting flags could cause such an uproar. Yet Karen's authority as HOA chair was formidable. People feared that tangling with her might lead to steep fines or other reprisal. Ms. Bunting was no fighter, but she felt a mounting sense of injustice. I've sold quite a few items already, and the donors have praised how welcoming my booth feels, Ms. Bunting said softly. Isn't that a good thing for Cedar Grove's reputation? Karen's expression darkened. Cedar Grove's reputation depends on order, not whimsical crafts, she retorted. She jabbed a finger at one crocheted blanket in a vibrant turquoise color. That shade alone is glaring. Before Ms. Bunting could respond, a middle-aged man with a broad smile stepped up to buy one of her baby blankets. My daughter just had a baby, he explained. This will be perfect. He paid Ms. Bunting, who handed him the neatly folded blanket with a grateful nod. The moment demonstrated how the crocheted items were genuinely helping the cause. But Karen remained unmoved. She scribbled something on her clipboard, then said, This is your final warning. Either comply or remove your booth. Ms. Bunting's lip trembled. She wished she could produce a neutral tablecloth out of thin air to appease Karen. But she refused to let the crocheted flags, the final flourish of her craft, go without a fight. They signified so much more than just decoration. They symbolized a personal touch that Ms. Bunting believed was vital for a successful charity event. "Please, Ms. Atwood," Ms. Bunting implored, her voice quavering slightly. "This is all for sick children. If you truly love this community, can't you allow a bit of color for charity's sake?" Karen's gaze was stone cold. "You have until I return," she said, turning on her heel. The tension in the air was palpable. As Karen disappeared into the crowd, Miss Bunting felt tears prick at her eyes. She glanced around at the neighbors who stood watching. A few offered encouraging nods or mumbled words of support, but nobody wanted to challenge Karen in front of everyone. Miss Bunting tried to swallow the lump in her throat and focus on the reason she was there, to do good. Little did she know that Karen's next visit would escalate into a scene that no one in Cedar Grove would soon forget. As midday arrived, the bazaar was at its peak. Dozens of families browsing, children clutching dollar bills to buy sweet treats, and elderly couples strolling hand in hand, enjoying the lively atmosphere. The aroma of fresh-baked goods wafted from a corner booth, mixing with the gentle sounds of laughter and conversation. Ms. Bunting had sold a heartening number of crocheted items, enough to fill her donation jar with a modest wad of cash. Her initial apprehension lifted each time a new customer admired her carefully stitched pieces. Her lilac tablecloth fluttered in the breeze, seemingly indifferent to the tension brewing behind the scenes. But then Ms. Bunting spotted Karen marching toward her booth from the far side of the park, shoulders stiff, expression thunderous. The sight alone gave Ms. Bunting a sinking feeling in her stomach. Karen's pace was more forceful than before, as though fueled by a fresh wave of anger. The older woman braced herself. Surely she won't create a scene at a charity function, right? Ms. Bunting thought. She couldn't have been more mistaken. Karen arrived, jabbing a finger toward the crocheted flags. "You ignored my warning," she hissed, her voice low but trembling with pent-up fury. "I see no changes to comply with the guidelines." "I couldn't find another tablecloth," Ms. Bunting stammered, a knot forming in her chest. "And I've been selling items nonstop. These crocheted flags are no harm." Karen's eyes flashed. "They are a breach of aesthetic uniformity," she snapped, raising her voice enough that people nearby paused to watch. "We can't have your booth sticking out like a clown tent while everyone else follows the rules. This is what's wrong with letting personal taste overrule community standards." Ms. Bunting's hands shook around a crocheted stuffed kitten she'd been rearranging. "I'm sorry, but it's not hurting anyone," she pleaded. "We're just trying to raise money for—" "Stop making ugly yarn crafts," Karen spat, words laced with malice. "You think you're above the rules because it's for charity? I've put up with enough excuses from you. Either dismantle these decorations or leave." The conversation had grown louder, drawing a crowd of onlookers. Shock registered on people's faces, many of whom recognized Ms. Bunting as a harmless, kindly soul. A hush fell, as if everyone sensed a storm was about to break. And then it happened. In a fit of unhinged frustration, Karen reached out and flipped the table where Ms. Bunting's crocheted items were displayed. The world seemed to slow as the tablecloth, crocheted flags, hats, blankets, and stuffed animals went flying into the air, scattering across the grass and pavement. The donation jar tumbled, spilling cash and coins that clinked and rolled in every direction. Ms. Bunting let out a frightened gasp, eyes wide as she watched her beloved creations, each one crafted with hours of care, land in a chaotic heap on the ground. The crowd erupted in gasps and exclamations of disbelief. It was as though someone had unleashed a bomb in the middle of the tranquil charity bazaar. "Karen," someone yelled. "What the hell are you doing?" Others rushed to help Ms. Bunting gather her fallen items. A crocheted blanket had landed in a muddy puddle near the edge of the walkway, stained with dark splashes. Stuffed animals lay scattered, some with their stitching torn from the force of the impact. Ms. Bunting dropped to her knees, tears pooling in her eyes. She delicately picked up a pastel baby hat that had rolled onto the sidewalk, brushing off a smear of dirt. As the stunned crowd closed in, Karen looked momentarily shocked at her own action, but her anger prevailed. She squared her shoulders. "I told her to remove the unauthorized decorations," she insisted. "If she refuses to follow the rules, there are consequences." A chorus of voices erupted, scolding Karen for her outrageous behavior. Someone began filming on their phone. Another ran to retrieve the scattered money from the donation jar. The entire park buzzed with scandalized whispers, many calling for someone to intervene or call the HOA board members to the scene. For Ms. Bunting, the world narrowed to the heartbreak of seeing her handiwork strewn across the ground. She had spent countless evenings crocheting those pieces, pouring love into every stitch, only to witness them kicked around like garbage. Tears slid down her cheeks as a wave of devastation settled in her chest. "Why?" she whispered, voice trembling. "How could you do this?" Karen folded her arms, jaw tight. "Don't play the victim," she snapped. "You violated." But she never finished her sentence. A group of neighbors stepped forward, forming a barrier between Karen and Ms. Bunting. One neighbor, voice shaking with rage, said, "That's enough, Karen. Back off." In that moment, it was clear Karen had gone too far. Her obsession with control had manifested in an act of physical aggression that no one could condone. The hush that followed was thick with shock and anger. People glared at Karen, their once private exasperation now out in the open, replaced by open hostility. Even those who had previously complied with her rules were appalled. And in the silence, Ms. Bunting remained kneeling on the grass, cradling a crocheted blanket streaked with mud, tears falling into the yarn. At that moment, she felt a stinging sense of helplessness, uncertain how to fix what had just been broken. Both her handcrafted goods and the trust she once had that Cedar Grove was a kind community. Within minutes, the entire bazaar seemed to revolve around the scene of the flipped crochet table. Word traveled quickly that Karen, the iron-handed HOA chair, had physically upended a charity booth. People abandoned their own stands to see if Ms. Bunting needed help. Volunteers scrambled to gather the fallen crocheted items, shaking off dirt or carefully placing them in a safe spot away from the foot traffic. Ms. Bunting was overwhelmed by gratitude as strangers knelt beside her, consoling her with gentle words. One teenager, cheeks red with indignation, bent down to pick up hats and stuffed animals, asking softly, "Are you okay, ma'am?" Another neighbor wiped mud off a crocheted baby blanket with a tissue, muttering about how unforgivable Karen's act was. Several outraged bystanders surrounded Karen, demanding an explanation or an apology. Karen, flustered and no longer so confident, tried to maintain her composure. She refused to comply with guidelines, Karen insisted, arms folded protectively. But the typically docile crowd was having none of it. "How can you talk about guidelines when you just assaulted someone's property?" a woman shouted. "Your behavior is disgraceful," another chimed in. "Apologize to her," yelled a man in a baseball cap. Karen's expression flickered with something like fear, but she refused to back down. "I did what was necessary to uphold the standards of Cedar Grove," she said, though her voice was quieter now. "I might have reacted strongly, but—" "Strongly," a volunteer repeated, stunned. "You flipped a table at a charity event." Meanwhile, Ms. Bunting looked around at the devastation. Many of her crocheted items were soiled, and some had come undone at the seams. Her donation jar was cracked, although the cash and coins had been mostly retrieved, scattered in the arms of well-meaning neighbors. The lilac tablecloth she'd worked so hard on lay crumpled near the table's legs, stained with footprints and smears of grass. Trembling, Ms. Bunting cleared her throat. "Thank you," she whispered to those helping her. Glancing at Karen, she mustered a shaky question. "Why would you do this?" These were for children battling cancer." Karen averted her gaze, lips pressed into a grim line. "It's about the rules," she repeated, but the conviction in her voice had waned. People shook their heads, muttering darkly. The wave of communal anger had reached a boiling point. In the midst of the uproar, a short, bespectacled man named Tom Hines, one of the bazaar organizers, pushed his way to the front. "Karen, you need to step back," he ordered. "I'm on the planning committee. You had no authority to do this." Karen opened her mouth to protest, but Tom added, "And if you can't remain civil, we'll have to ask you to leave the event entirely. Is that clear?" For a tense moment, it seemed Karen might lash out again. But perhaps sensing the crowd's mood, she snapped her clipboard under her arm and spun on her heel, storming away from the park. Onlookers released the collective breath they'd been holding. Yet a pall of shock and sadness lingered in the air. With Karen gone, neighbors refocused on Ms. Bunting, helping her salvage whatever they could. Children scrambled after the crocheted stuffed animals. Adults pooled their resources, offering to rinse the muddy blankets in a nearby restroom sink, or to re-iron the tablecloth if it could be salvaged. Someone collected the money donations and placed them in a new, sealed container to keep them safe. Though Ms. Bunting couldn't stop the tears from slipping down her cheeks, she was touched by the community's rallying spirit. "Thank you," she said again and again, voice trembling with emotion. She had never wanted to cause a stir, only to raise money for sick children. And now this fiasco, Karen's meltdown, threatened to overshadow the entire reason for the event. But if there was a silver lining, it shone in the empathy of the neighbors. One by one, people offered to help Ms. Bunting reset her display. Soon enough, the booth was upright again, albeit with a makeshift table covering a volunteer had found in their trunk. The crocheted items, though dirted or slightly damaged, were displayed as best as possible, and supportive visitors pressed extra cash into Ms. Bunting's donation jar out of sheer sympathy. The sense of community triumphed, at least momentarily. And as Ms. Bunting gazed around at the concerned faces, she realized that Karen's cruelty might have inadvertently awakened a stronger bond among the residents of Cedar Grove, a bond that would not only salvage her crocheted charity, but elevate it to new heights. Word of Karen's table-flipping incident spread like wildfire, not just among the bazaar attendees, but throughout the entire Cedar Grove neighborhood and beyond. Photographs captured the aftermath, Ms. Bunting on her knees, clutching a soiled crocheted blanket, neighbors rushing to her aid. Video clips circulated on social media, showing Karen's shocking outburst. People shared and reshared the post with captions like, "HOA chair flips charity table," and "This is what happens when HOA power goes too far." Local news outlets got wind of the drama. A small community paper ran an article headlined, "Crochet for a Cause, Sabotaged by HOA Chair." The piece detailed Ms. Bunting's charitable mission and Karen's violent reaction. Public sentiment overwhelmingly sided with Ms. Bunting. Comments under the article ranged from sympathetic, "My heart breaks for that poor woman," to furious, "Karen needs to be removed from the HOA for this." Back in Cedar Grove, the day after the bazaar, Ms. Bunting awoke feeling a mix of exhaustion and grief. She had barely slept, haunted by the image of her crocheted creations hitting the ground. Marmalade the cat sensed her distress, curling close beside her, purring softly. She worried that the damage to her items might mean a smaller donation to the children's hospital. To her surprise, she found her front porch covered with flowers, handwritten notes, and even fresh balls of yarn. Neighbors and strangers alike had dropped by overnight, leaving tokens of support. One note read, "Don't give up on your generosity. We're behind you." Another, "Your crochet is beautiful, and so are you. Thank you for helping the children." Tears filled Ms. Bunting's eyes as she read each kind message. A few hours later, a group of volunteers arrived at her door. They introduced themselves as local crafters who had seen the photos online. "We want to help," one woman said, carrying a sewing kit. "We can fix or wash any damaged items." Ms. Bunting was stunned by the outpouring of kindness. She led them into her living room, where the soiled and torn crocheted goods lay in boxes. As the volunteers started washing, mending, and gently restitching the pieces, Ms. Bunting felt her hope rekindle. They worked for hours, chatting about their own experiences with crocheting, knitting, and how they believed Ms. Bunting's cause was too important to let one terrible incident derail it. Meanwhile, other neighbors had a different idea. They decided that Ms. Bunting deserved a grand gesture of solidarity, something that would publicly counter Karen's destructive act. So they contacted Tom Hines from the Charity Bazaar Committee and suggested reorganizing a community crochet sale in Ms. Bunting's honor. They envisioned setting up a special booth at the park with a bold sign reading "Community Crochet" and offering Ms. Bunting a prime spot under a pop-up canopy, free of any HOA interference. When Tom knocked on Ms. Bunting's door to present the idea, she was initially overwhelmed. "All this for me?" she asked, voice quavering with emotion. "I don't want to cause more trouble." Tom shook his head. "You didn't cause trouble, Ms. Bunting. Karen did," he said firmly. "The community wants to show you we stand by your cause. All these crocheted items are going to help children who need it. We won't let one person's actions ruin that." Ms. Bunting pressed a trembling hand to her chest, tears of gratitude in her eyes. "I'd be honored," she whispered. I never dreamed so many people would come together for some crochet. The details came together quickly. A date was set for the following Saturday. Enough time for Ms. Bunting and her new volunteer crew to fix, clean, and repackage all the crocheted items. Word spread through local bulletins, social media groups, and flyers tacked to community boards. Neighbors offered to contribute homemade crafts or baked goods, turning the event into a mini fundraiser centered around Ms. Bunting's crocheted handiwork. The big difference? This time, Karen wouldn't be running the show. The booth would be run independently at the park, with the city's blessing rather than the HOA's. The moral groundswell was undeniable. People donated more yarn, offered to help staff the booth, and pledged to buy extra items to support the children's hospital. In the space of a few days, Ms. Bunting went from disheartened victim to a symbol of communal goodwill. Her crocheted hats and blankets became more than just crafts. They represented a stand against petty tyranny and a beacon of hope for those who believed in generosity over rigid rules. Karen, for her part, had retreated into silence. Rumors circulated that she was receiving calls from outraged neighbors, demanding explanations or apologies. The HOA board members were privately discussing possible disciplinary actions against her, though no official statement had been released. Many speculated Karen was too embarrassed or too angry to show her face around the neighborhood. But for Ms. Bunting, the focus was on healing, both literal and figurative. Each repaired stitch became a testament to the neighborhood's unity. Every bright yarn color, once scattered in the dirt, now gleamed with renewed purpose. The following Saturday arrived with a light breeze and warm sunshine, ideal conditions for an outdoor event. At the center of Cedar Grove's main park stood a new pop-up canopy, decked with a large banner that read, "Community Crochet," in support of pediatric cancer research. Underneath it, tables displayed row upon row of Ms. Bunting's crocheted works, now restored to their full vibrancy. The entire arrangement was meticulously organized, but also colorful and inviting. Far from the muted uniformity Karen had once tried to impose. Volunteers bustled around, carefully hanging crocheted bunting flags around the canopy's edges. This time, the pastel triangles were a proud statement of solidarity rather than a violation of any rule. Ms. Bunting stood behind the main table, hands clasped together. She wore a soft pink blouse, her hair in its usual neat bun, and though a flicker of nerves danced in her eyes, she was mostly filled with gratitude. Visitors trickled in as soon as the event opened, some bringing small children eager to pick out crocheted stuffed animals, others stopping by to purchase colorful blankets to give as gifts. Many recognized Ms. Bunting from the news stories and were excited to show support. A local news reporter even arrived with a small camera crew to film the sale, capturing the spirit of generosity that radiated from the booth. "Thank you so much," Ms. Bunting told each customer, pressing her hands to her heart. She repeated the phrase dozens of times as people dropped extra bills into the donation jar, which now sat safely on a sturdier table, well out of flipping range. Every kind word, every supportive gesture, strengthened her resolve that compassion could triumph over cruelty. By midday, a steady crowd filled the park. A local bakery donated cupcakes, placing them on a side table labeled, "Enjoy a treat, support a good cause." A group of teenage musicians offered acoustic performances, strumming cheerful tunes that added to the festive atmosphere. The sense of unity in the air was palpable, neighbors greeting each other warmly, exchanging stories, and collectively celebrating Ms. Bunting's comeback. At one point, Ms. Bunting noticed a small cluster of people whispering and glancing toward the sidewalk. She followed their gaze and felt her heart skip a beat. Karen stood at a distance, watching the scene from behind dark sunglasses. Ms. Bunting's stomach twisted with anxiety. For a moment, she feared another outburst. But Karen didn't approach the booth. She simply observed, lips pressed in a thin line. Then, after a few tense minutes, she turned and walked away. Ms. Bunting released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Whatever Karen's thoughts, the event went on without disruption. By mid-afternoon, the donation jar had grown heavy with cash. Volunteers had to empty it twice into a secure lockbox. A whiteboard next to the booth showed how much money had been raised so far, and each time the tally went up, applause broke out. When the sun began to sink low, Ms. Bunting found herself approached by the news reporter. The camera operator behind him signaled they were rolling. Ms. Bunting, the reporter asked, how does it feel to see such a tremendous outpouring of support after what happened last week? Ms. Bunting's voice wavered with emotion as she replied, I'm overwhelmed by everyone's kindness. When my work was scattered on the ground, I thought it was the end of my dream to help these children. But instead, people came together, neighbors, strangers, to fix what was broken. It's restored my faith in the goodness of this community. The reporter smiled, capturing her words for the segment. After he wrapped up the brief interview, Ms. Bunting watched him walk away, feeling a spark of pride. She wasn't one to seek the spotlight, but if this attention meant more donations for sick children, it was well worth it. Shortly before closing time, Tom Hines clapped his hands to get everyone's attention. Folks, we're tallying up the final donations now, he announced, gesturing toward the whiteboard. As the final numbers were posted, an audible gasp rippled through the crowd. Ms. Bunting's crocheted creations had raised twice as much as her original goal, double what she had managed to collect during a typical charity event in previous years. A chorus of cheers erupted. Ms. Bunting's eyes shone with tears of joy. She glanced around at the supportive faces, remembering the heartbreak she'd felt when Karen flipped her table. Now, instead of defeat, she was witnessing a triumph made possible by the united spirit of the neighborhood. It was a victory not only for her, but for every child who would benefit from the generosity. As the day came to a close, Ms. Bunting found herself hugging volunteers and neighbors, thanking them profusely. She felt a profound sense of belonging that she hadn't experienced since her husband passed away. In that moment, the crocheted hats, blankets, and stuffed animals represented more than just cozy accessories. They had become symbols of resilience and community. While Ms. Bunting's community crochet event soared, Karen faced a reckoning within the HOA. The footage of her table-flipping meltdown had reached even the more reserved board members, who typically supported her strict interpretations of regulations. During an emergency meeting, the board reviewed the incident, accompanied by witness statements, some written, others on video. A serious debate erupted. Could the HOA continue with Karen at the helm, given her actions? Some argued that she had become a liability, giving Cedar Grove a bad name. Others, who were close friends with Karen, hesitated. They pointed out her years of service to the neighborhood, meticulously enforcing rules that many believed helped preserve property values. Yet even these supporters found it hard to defend physical aggression at a charity function. Karen herself was conspicuously absent from the meeting, claiming health concerns. Some suspected she was simply avoiding the public grilling. Over the next week, rumors circulated about possible disciplinary measures, censure, suspension, or even removal from her position as HOA chair. Residents whispered that she might choose to resign rather than face an expulsion vote. While the board deliberated, Karen mostly stayed behind closed doors. Neighbors rarely saw her patrolling as she used to, and the few who dared ring her doorbell were met with silence. That abrupt retreat fueled speculation. A handful of people felt a twinge of pity. Karen had clearly overstepped, but it was still unsettling to see her go from unstoppable rule enforcer to social pariah overnight. Meanwhile, the broader neighborhood sentiment had shifted decisively in Ms. Bunting's favor. Social media groups buzzed with supportive posts about the crocheter's success and condemnation of Karen's actions. Local vendors offered Ms. Bunting free supplies, and a craft store downtown even proposed hosting a monthly crochet circle in her name to continue supporting pediatric charities. In a matter of days, Ms. Bunting went from a quiet hobbyist to a beloved figurehead of Cedar Grove's compassionate side. Ultimately, an official HOA statement was released. Karen would no longer serve as chair. The board explained she had stepped down, though no one believed it was wholly voluntary. The statement expressed regret over the incident and promised to revisit the HOA's leadership structure to ensure no one person wielded too much power in the future. While the board stopped short of revoking her membership in the association, the damage to Karen's reputation was done. Sometime later, a neighbor reported seeing Karen loading boxes into her car, possibly preparing to move out of Cedar Grove altogether. Whether she left for good or simply stayed indoors was uncertain, but her presence, and her reign of strict rule enforcement, diminished considerably. Many felt a sense of relief, as though a burdensome yoke had been lifted from the community's shoulders. Yet a few neighbors remained curious. Why had Karen become so tyrannical in the first place? Some guessed she felt overshadowed or unappreciated, channeling her frustrations into HOA micromanagement. Others shrugged it off, grateful to see her grip on power broken. For Ms. Bunting, the resolution was bittersweet. She bore no ill will, despite her heartbreak. In interviews and in conversations with neighbors, she often said, "I just hope Ms. Atwood can find peace and kindness in her life. We all have our hardships." Her capacity for forgiveness only endeared her further to the community. In the grand tapestry of Cedar Grove's history, Karen's meltdown would remain a cautionary tale, but Ms. Bunting's story would stand as a shining example of compassion prevailing over aggression, an enduring reminder that a single crocheted blanket, made with love, can inspire an entire neighborhood to stand together. A few weeks after the community crochet sale, life in Cedar Grove settled into a more peaceful rhythm. Neighbors still marveled at how quickly the atmosphere had changed. Gone were the daily threats of fines for minor deviations. Gone were the ominous clack of Karen's heels on the sidewalk. Though the HOA still existed, its new acting chairperson, a mild-mannered retiree named Mr. Langford, took a more balanced approach. He replaced Karen's authoritarian style with open communication and monthly town hall gatherings where residents could voice concerns without fear of retribution. Meanwhile, Ms. Bunting experienced a surge of visitors dropping by her home. Parents came to thank her for crocheting hats or blankets that had cheered their kids. Fellow crafters sought advice on stitch patterns. Some simply wanted to say hello to the woman whose story of resilience had touched them. And Ms. Bunting, who had long grieved quietly for her late husband, found a renewed sense of community. She formed friendships that went beyond polite waves on the sidewalk. On one delightful afternoon, a group of neighbors showed up at her house with refreshments, turning her living room into an impromptu crafting circle. They chatted, laughed, and shared stories as their crochet hooks clicked in unison. Ms. Bunting's cat, Marmalade, wandered among them, basking in the new sense of fellowship. Such gatherings became a regular occurrence. Soon, Ms. Bunting was guiding novices through basic stitches and teaching them how to read simple patterns. The local craft store that had reached out hosted monthly Crochet for Charity sessions, inviting not just Ms. Bunting, but anyone who wanted to donate handcrafted items to local causes. People crocheted hats for cancer patients, scarves for the homeless, and tiny blankets for premature babies in the neonatal ICU. Cedar Grove, once known for its manicured lawns and HOA rules, was now gaining a reputation for generosity and creative collaboration. In a twist of fate, the crocheting that Karen had so vehemently derided, ugly yarn crafts, became a cornerstone of Cedar Grove's identity. Far from tarnishing the neighborhood's image, it elevated it. Families driving past saw yard signs proclaiming things like "proud supporter of community crochet" and "crafting kindness here." Even businesses in the nearby town displayed crocheted hearts or colorful doilies in their windows, referencing Cedar Grove's big-hearted spirit. Every time Ms. Bunting witnessed these signs of solidarity, she felt a surge of warmth. She had never sought to be a local hero, but that was exactly how many saw her. In their eyes, her gentle perseverance had toppled Karen's tyranny. She had proven that no matter how controlling a figure might seem, the power of collective goodwill could overcome even the most rigid rules. In a quiet way, Ms. Bunting's story spread beyond Cedar Grove. Articles about the crocheted charity sale circulated on community forums, sparking conversations about the pitfalls of overbearing HOAs and the resilience of neighbors who stand together. People from nearby towns wrote to Ms. Bunting, asking for tips on starting their own crochet fundraisers. She always responded with modest enthusiasm, explaining that you just needed yarn, a few hooks, and a compassionate purpose. And so, Ms. Bunting settled into a life richer in friendships and purpose than she had imagined possible. She continued her crocheting, occasionally pausing to marvel at how a once simple charity booth had catalyzed such an outpouring of kindness. In her home, the yarn baskets never ran empty, thanks to frequent donations. She joked that she could probably crochet until the end of her days and still have leftover yarn. As for Karen, rare glimpses of her around town were enough to confirm she hadn't moved away entirely. Yet she kept a low profile, avoiding community events. When the subject of her meltdown surfaced, she either briskly changed the topic or left the conversation altogether. To those who tried to empathize or ask about her state of mind, she offered curt, evasive answers. It was clear she carried some shame, though she never issued a public apology. Perhaps, in her own time, she might reflect on the fact that her aggression had ironically multiplied Ms. Bunting's success, making the crocheter a beloved figure in Cedar Grove history. Whether Karen acknowledged it or not, the transformation of the neighborhood remained undeniable. From a place of enforced conformity, Cedar Grove had emerged as a tapestry of unity, all woven together by the threads of one elderly woman's crochet. As summer turned to fall, Cedar Grove's oak-lined streets took on a golden hue, and the mild breeze carried the scent of turning leaves. Residents continued their daily routines, work commutes, yard chores, school pickups, but a gentle spirit of camaraderie lingered. The crochet for charity sessions remained popular, growing into a broader craft for a cause movement that welcomed knitters, quilters, and anyone with an urge to give back. Local nonprofits benefited immensely. The Children's Cancer Ward at Maple Hospital sent a heartfelt letter of thanks to Ms. Bunting, praising her for raising funds and donating dozens of cozy blankets that had brightened the spirits of young patients. Ms. Bunting read it aloud at one crafting circle, tears welling in her eyes. Applause and sniffles of joy followed. Meanwhile, the HOA, under Mr. Langford's more relaxed leadership, implemented changes to prevent future abuses of power. They formed committees that included a range of residents, young parents, retirees, working professionals, ensuring that no single individual's preferences could dominate unopposed. The new guidelines allowed for more flexibility with events and decorations, encouraging creativity instead of stifling it. People joked that if Ms. Bunting wanted a booth draped in rainbow yarn next year, the HOA would likely cheer her on rather than force her to hide it under a dull cover. For Ms. Bunting, this shift was the ultimate gift. She had always believed that communities thrived when neighbors lifted each other up. Now she saw that vision unfolding daily. There were no more anxious glances over shoulders to see if Karen was patrolling. No more fear that a bright flower or a quirky mailbox ornament would incite a scolding. Instead, there was the freedom to express individuality without sacrificing the collective well-being. On a crisp Saturday morning, Ms. Bunting decided to take a leisurely walk around the neighborhood. Marmalade, eager for fresh air, trotted alongside her on a harness. As she strolled, she noticed small acts of kindness everywhere. Handwritten signs offering free produce from someone's overflowing garden, chalk drawings on driveways welcoming neighbors to stop and chat, a newly installed little free library where children could swap books. At one point, Ms. Bunting passed a quiet cul-de-sac where she spotted Karen stepping out of her car. Their eyes met. For a tense moment, neither moved. Karen looked thinner, perhaps more tired, but she still wore that guarded expression Ms. Bunting remembered from the bazaar. Ms. Bunting felt a pang of sympathy and mustered a gentle smile. She raised her hand in a small wave, as if to say, "No hard feelings." Karen hesitated, then gave a stiff nod in return before retreating into her house. It was not reconciliation, but it was a start. Sighing softly, Ms. Bunting continued her walk. She felt both relief and sadness at the sight of Karen. It reminded her that healing, from such a dramatic confrontation, would take time and might never be complete. Still, Ms. Bunting believed in the power of extending warmth, even to those who had shown cruelty. Her hope was that maybe one day, Karen would embrace a less hostile way of interacting with the world. Back home, Ms. Bunting retrieved a half-finished blanket from her favorite armchair and resumed crocheting, letting the rhythmic motion calm her mind. She thought of how her life had changed since that fateful day Karen flipped her table. At first, it was a nightmare of torn yarn and shattered trust. But in its aftermath, she had discovered a deeper sense of community, a personal renewal, and a mission that continued to grow. She gazed at a framed letter on her side table, the one from the Children's Hospital, signed by several young patients. Their scrawled crayons spelled out, "Thank you, Ms. Bunting," in a rainbow of colors. Ms. Bunting felt her heart swell with gratitude. After losing her husband, she had feared she might drift through her twilight years without leaving much of an impact. But now, she realized how one person's simple passion for crocheting, combined with a neighborhood's compassion, could leave a lasting, joyful imprint. In that sense, Karen's sabotage had ironically sown the seeds of something beautiful. And Ms. Bunting understood that sometimes, from an act of destruction, a new pattern emerges, one woven from threads of empathy, resilience, and the shared determination to stand against cruelty. Cedar Grove was living proof that even the most tyrannical attempts to stifle kindness could never truly prevail. Several months later, Cedar Grove hosted its next big community gathering, this time a harvest fair. As part of the fair, Ms. Bunting was invited to set up a crocheting demonstration booth. She was greeted with enthusiastic applause when she arrived with her yarn and hooks. No one demanded a dull vinyl tablecloth or neutral decor. In fact, the fair's organizers encouraged her to display her crocheted bunting flags, precisely because they added a bright, inviting flair. Throughout the day, Ms. Bunting showed visitors how to crochet basic stitches. Children sat cross-legged, enthralled by the colorful yarn. Adults asked for tips on starting their own charity craft projects. The new HOA chair, Mr. Langford, stopped by to thank Ms. Bunting for her invaluable role in bringing the community closer together. In a final, unexpected turn, Ms. Bunting learned that the local television station wanted to feature her in a short segment about Cedar Grove's philanthropic revival. At first, she balked. She was just a simple crocheter, after all. But eventually, she agreed, believing it might inspire other neighborhoods to rally behind charitable crafting too. The footage aired the following week, showing Ms. Bunting's gentle smile and her crocheted booth, with a proud mention of how her crocheted items had doubled the fundraiser totals for children in need. Thus, Ms. Bunting's story became part of Cedar Grove's lore. In living rooms and over backyard fences, neighbors spoke of the day Karen flipped the table, ironically catapulting Ms. Bunting's charity to newfound success. They spoke of how a surge of empathy overpowered a tyrant's outburst, weaving the neighborhood into a closer-knit family than ever before. And they noted how one elderly woman's unwavering kindness served as a model for weathering adversity with grace. No one could predict exactly what the future held. Karen might re-emerge in some capacity, though her power and influence had been severely diminished. Ms. Bunting might eventually slow down her crocheting or pass on her knowledge to younger enthusiasts. Still, the lessons from that explosive day would remain. That compassion can arise from calamity, that communities thrive when they lift each other up, and that the simplest of crafts, like a soft crocheted hat, can convey more warmth and solidarity than any number of rigid rules. In the end, Ms. Bunting's crocheted blankets might fray with time, and the memory of Karen's meltdown might fade. But the spirit of generosity, once awakened, was here to stay. In Cedar Grove, the story of the crocheted table would be told, retold, and cherished, a testament to the power of ordinary people coming together to reclaim kindness in the face of anger. And so, the final stitches of this chapter in Cedar Grove's history were formed by many hands, united in their resolve that the neighborhood's heart would forever remain as soft and comforting as Ms. Bunting's very best yarn.